Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 6 on the Name of the Rose. And tonight we return, well, we may get as far as the second corpse. Not that we saw the first corpse. We heard rumors of the first corpse. The second corpse we get a much closer and more bloody encounter with. But before that, we have to talk about magic, such as eyeglasses and things like that. All right. Okay. First, just a quick reminder, I would draw your attention again to the Kickstarter that we are running for our Rings and Realms show. Maggie Park and I doing Rings and Realms again this year. We made an announcement just earlier this week that we're going to be partnering for at least the last episode of the season. We're going to be joined by a special guest, Matt from Nerd of the Rings. It's going to be a delightful collaboration. Matt's delightful to work with. Anyway, there's a lot going on there. I will also add, we should be good for much of the rest of August here, but things might get a little dodgy as we get into September and the middle of October. There's going to be a lot happening here in the next couple months, and it's not impossible that I will end up having to miss some other classes, some other class session times. So we'll see how we do. But anyway, let us jump back into the text here this evening. So right after their conversation in the library, we're still on the first day, though we're totally finishing the first day today. That's absolutely what's happening. We go and we talk to the Master Glazier, and they have an interesting conversation about magic. So William has just shown to Nicholas, the Master Glazier, his spectacles, his little pince-nez that he carries, because, of course, he is getting up there and is getting rather farsighted, which I understand. Nicholas, the Master Glazier, is, of course, very impressed. "What a wonder," Nicholas continued. "And yet many would speak of witchcraft and diabolical machination." "You can certainly speak of magic in this device," William allowed. "But there are two forms of magic. There is a magic that is the work of the devil, and which aims at man's downfall through artifices of which it is not licit to speak. But there is a magic that is divine, where God's knowledge is made manifest through the knowledge of man, and it serves to transform nature, and one of its ends is to prolong man's very life. And this is holy magic, to which the learned must devote themselves more and more, not only to discover new things, but also to rediscover many secrets of nature that divine wisdom had revealed to the Hebrews, the Greeks, to other ancient peoples, and even today to the infidels. And I cannot tell you all the wonderful things on optics and the science of vision to be read in the books of the infidels. And Christian knowledge must regain possession of all this learning, taking it from the pagans and infidels, tamquam ab injustis possessoribus, as they had no right to hold it." Okay, so this makes you think of Clark. Yeah, it's like that, actually, in its way. Sort of thinking of, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic, right, is the quotation. Yeah, any technology significantly advanced is indistinguishable from magic. Yeah, exactly. So one thing that I would want to emphasize, one thing I want to emphasize here, it's possible to imagine, if you were to read this paragraph from William in a certain tone, it could sound kind of condescending, right? That is like, you could say, but there is a magic that is divine, right? This is holy magic. Magic that is divine, where God's knowledge is made manifest through the knowledge of man. One might be tempted to kind of read this in a tone as if like this is someone who does not believe in any of these things, right? But only believes in science and is kind of using this language in order to talk down to an ignorant person. That is one kind of framework in which one could potentially read this. And I don't think that that is correct. Once again, I think that Umberto Eco has been really pretty consistent. He is doing medieval world building, right? He is wanting to bring us to invest a secondary belief. Not that he's writing what that he's writing is medieval, and yes, there are certainly moments when one can suspect that Umberto Eco does not in fact share the worldview of the 14th century monks and friars that he is describing. And yet I, as someone who has spent a lot of time reading medieval literature, I really love the way in which he has really invested himself in making them really talk like medieval people and use the conceptions of medieval people. So one thing that I would emphasize here, Eric, I think that is right. It's sincere and poetic. Yeah. But it's also literally true. This is what magic means. Now, of course, I don't need to lecture Tolkien fans, usually, about the fact that the word magic is a squirrely word, right? It's a word which is used in lots of different ways, with lots of different, kind of implications and inflections, and means some very, very different things to very different people, right? No, there's one thing. Hang on. Let me do it this way. First, look at how he defines. He doesn't explicitly define it, the word magic, William, in this paragraph. But he gives a clear sense of what the word magic means. So when he says there are two forms of magic, what does that mean? What is the word magic? He affirms, he says, you can certainly speak of magic in this device. What does that mean to him? What does the word magic mean? There is a magic that is divine, where God's knowledge is made manifest through the knowledge of man, and it serves to transform nature. And one of its ends is to prolong man's very life. It serves to transform nature. So I would suggest that William is using the word magic to mean a practice which brings about an effect in the primary world. Primary world is Tolkien's language, not the language of the text. So I want to be careful with that. Anyway, but still we can see transforming nature, transforming the world around us, right? If you can, by some practice, do a thing which brings about a desired end, right? It's the power to work wonders. Yeah, now, wonders, though, is subjective. Subjective in the sense that, it depends on whether people marvel at it or not, right? I think more accurately, again, magic, not just power. I'm actually wanting to avoid the word power because, again, that's not exactly how he talks about it. He says there's magic in this device. There's magic in his spectacles, right? And he doesn't mean that his spectacles have power exactly, right? It's not exactly about power. Again, it's magic is a technique, or it is a, actions that one can perform that brings about results. And usually, and I will say, Eric, I think maybe wonder is perhaps too strong, potentially, but at the very least, in ways which are not going to be obvious to other people. There's always something somewhat arcane about it, right? So like, if I, take this cup and I'm like, I'm going to cause this cup to move from this place to that place, right? And I pick it up and move it over there. No one's going to call that magic, right? I still create an effect in the world. Like the cup was here and now it's over there, right? Like that's me creating an effect in the world around us, right? There's me transforming nature, right? In its way. But no one would call that magic because the cause is plain. Like I picked it up with my hand. Everyone knows and sees the cause, right? But if you, if a cause is created, if a result is created, the causes of which people don't understand, observers cannot understand, then that's magic, right? But it has to be something that you're in control of. It's something that you do in order to create a particular effect, and that effect is created, but others don't understand it. There is something obscure. There is something arcane about it, right? Hidden from the simple, right? This is still true of lots of things today, right? I have a fever. I swallow these 2 magic pills and my fever goes away, right? I don't know why. I don't understand it, right? I've been married to a doctor for a quarter of a century. I still don't really understand how that works, right? It's magic, right? There are lots of ways. No, Jocelyn, don't think in terms of nature and supernature. I think that's important. It's not about supernatural. That's a distinction that we would draw in trying to classify those things. And that, I think, is exactly the distinction that William is not making here, right? Oh my goodness, JJ, computers are absolutely magic to almost everybody. Yeah, exactly. I click here and this thing happens and I don't know why. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No question, William would look at a computer and say, you can certainly speak of magic in this device. For sure. But yeah, again, notice that he is not making a distinction. When he says there's 2 forms of magic, he's not making a distinction between natural and supernatural magic. Not knowing the link between cause and effect, yes. But again, or others not knowing the relationship. It's okay for you to know. William understands how his spectacles work, right? To him, they're not magical, but he says you can certainly speak of magic in this device, right? It is God's knowledge made manifest through the knowledge of man. This is not people do, like, glasses are not breaking God's laws, right? Your spectacles use God's laws. This is God's knowledge. God knows how optics works, right? He knows about the refraction of light, and he knows how our eyes work. God does, right? By our coming to understand it, and William being able to show that lenses of glass of this kind can create this refraction, which leads to the sharpening of sight. Right? That is man's knowledge making manifest the knowledge of God. That's divine magic. Right? This is a cause and effect that God has ordained, just as he ordains every other cause and effect. But we haven't always understood it. Right? And when we come to understand it, it is magic. It is holy magic. Holy magic to which the learned must devote themselves more and more. It serves to transform nature, and one of its ends is to prolong man's very life. The 2 forms of magic that he the two forms of magic that he's talking about are not exactly, he wouldn't use natural and supernatural. Because, remember, all nature is, in a sense, supernatural, right? God did it all. God's design is in it. There is nothing to say, to distinguish between the natural and the supernatural is to imply that there are some categories of things that have nothing to do with God or God's power. And that's ridiculous. Everything comes from God and is a reflection of God's power. Again, this is how they would have thought, certainly, what William is implying. No, the two forms, one form is a magic that is the work of the devil, and which aims at man's downfall through artifices of which it is not licit to speak. Okay. There were two schools of magic in the late Middle Ages, and especially in the Renaissance. This particularly took off in the Renaissance, right? William is kind of a proto-Renaissance dude, right? He's an early adopter on sort of what will become known as the Renaissance. Though, by the way, I find that word a little bit absurd. More than a little bit absurd. And even more sort of ignorant and insulting. But that is to say, the word Renaissance was used as an explicit insult to the Middle Ages. Exactly. Just like Dark Ages. In fact, the same people who called the early Middle Ages the Dark Ages are also the people who called the Renaissance, the rebirth, right? When civilization was reborn from the ashes after its long death, right, in the Middle Ages. There is so much more continuity between the Middle Ages and the so-called Renaissance. I kind of prefer early modern period. I'm willing to accept that what we call the Renaissance is sort of the beginning of the modern era, and in some ways more closely connected to modernity than it is to the ancient world. So early modern I can kind of live with, but Renaissance is sort of ridiculous. It is a much more dramatic story to think about it that way, Jocelyn. But you'll never get a medievalist to like it. Anyway, back to magic. As I say, this was a thing that existed in the Middle Ages, but it really came to prominence in the Renaissance. And that is, there were two new practices that were very, very popular. And both of them had the same goal. And the goal was transforming nature. Yeah, transforming nature. That is, there were two different means by which humans could gain control over the world around them. Again, you could say could acquire power, and it was very often about power. That is, the humans' power over their environment. But again, I want to avoid the word power because when you talk about magic and you talk about power and you talk about people having magic power, one tends to think in terms of like somebody who's born with a magic talent or something like that. You know, there are lots of stories like that, right? Where people are born with the ability to do things, right? And that's not, nobody believed that. That is not what magic was or how magic was talked about. The only power involved in magic is that magic was a technique that was designed to increase one's power. That is, one's ability to do things. With my own strength, I can pick up the cup and move it from one place to another. With my own native born resources, I'm able to do that. Indeed, not to brag, but I could even do more. I could probably pick up something even heavier than that cup and move it. But what if I wanted to pick up something even bigger, right? What if I wanted to pick up something that weighed 700 pounds? Well, I can't do that. I don't have the power to do that. how can I get the power to do that if I want to really need to move something that big and heavy? Well, there are two different techniques that people were keen to try. One, use a lever. Exactly. Yes, that is one form of magic. That is the holy magic of which William is talking, right? But one of these mechanisms, there's one way that we could do this, one way in which we can get power to control our environment. And that, of course, is from Satan. That is to say, there are some creatures that have... So let me back up from Satan a little bit and say one way in which you can exert power over your environment like that is to utilize the strength of others, to bring the strength of others under your control, right? So if I have a big, huge 700-pound block of stone and I'm, I don't know, a pharaoh, right? I might get many slaves, right? I might conquer many slaves, or, I don't know, take a bunch of Hebrew slaves in Egypt and make them move the block for me, right? That increases my power over my environment, right? That's not magic exactly, but it's another way to do things, right? To increase your power is to bring others under your control who can do those things together, right? But what if you need to do something that is even harder, right? Something that no number of people are able to do. Well, then you might have to really get creative, right? If you want to do something which people thought was impossible, like live forever, for instance, right? Then you might try controlling. You might try calling on the assistance of someone who does have the power to do that. Now, that's not you and that's not me, but there are creatures out there that have power, right? The, what's his phrase? Artifices of which it is not licit to speak. Artifices, note, right? There are techniques. There are things you can do. There are things that you can do which it was believed, right? There are things that you can do which can manipulate spirits. Spirits are out there. Demons are out there. And rumor is they're willing to negotiate, right? And that there are things that you can do, certain sigils that you can draw, certain rituals that you can perform that will enable you to control them, right? This is known, right? In the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages, this is known that that's possible, right? Okay. So, if you can do this, if you can perform these techniques, you can increase your own power over nature, right? But notice two things. One, this is not holy magic. This is not God's knowledge being made manifest through the knowledge of man. This is not utilizing, right? Like God invented glass. I mean, God invented light, right? So like the use of glass to refract, he invented the eye, he invented farsightedness, he invented glass, right? He invented light, all the properties of light, all these things. So in forming spectacles to give me the power to see more clearly than I otherwise would, or with William as well. William and I seem to have the same problem. Then you can, again, you're not doing anything unholy. You're not breaking God's order. You are just learning. You're transforming nature by having the knowledge of God made manifest by the knowledge of man, right? But if you're figuring out a ritual by which you can conjure, control, and utilize the power of a demon, that's not holy magic, right? You're trying to get around things, right? But note, the end is the same. The goal is the same. The goal is to increase human power over our environment, to increase human power over nature, to make us able to do things. These two things, C.S. Lewis is great on this. I think it's in The Discarded Image. He talks about this, where he says a lot of modern people don't understand this, that magic and science are born of the same impulse. They are twin siblings, born from the same impulse. This same impulse, this same desire, spawned these two twin children. One of them died in infancy, and the other one thrived and grew to a well-established adulthood. But they were born twins. And of course, what he also very appropriately emphasizes is that, do you know the primary reason why science thrived and what came later to be called magic, though both of them are magical in this sense? Do you know why science continued and, magic and sorcery, right? Because science worked and magic didn't. Exactly. That's exactly why. Yeah. Why did science take off in way like where alchemy didn't? Because alchemy didn't work. That's why. Yeah. Well, so now, Jocelyn, other traditions that would talk about magic still working, it's another, in some ways, it's another way to look even at science itself, right? We have learned to say, this works by science, when really in practice, what we're saying is this works by magic, in the sense that I don't understand. Like, if you use the one word to mean it works by this mysterious to me process that I don't understand. All I know is I do this thing and this other thing happens, right? I move this little lever on the wall and the lights come on in the room, right? You can call that science. You can call that magic. Doesn't much make a difference one way or the other, right? As far as my understanding of the thing. Yeah. Anyway, so, but now again, I'm not trying to get too philosophical about this. What I'm trying to do is provide an understanding for what he means by the word magic and why he's speaking very sincerely and saying you can certainly speak of magic in this device. So the one form of magic is the work of the devil, which aims at man's downfall through artifices of which it is not licit to speak. Because that's the real kicker about the whole demon summoning thing, is that it's all a fraud. Not a fraud. Like, it's worse than this is not just like a charlatan trying to deceive you into thinking they've summoned a demon. No, the problem is that the fraud, the manipulation, is from the demons themselves. It's not that the demons aren't there. It's that the demons are the ones running this whole scam, in fact, Williams suggests. That form of magic is a product of the devil, aiming at man's downfall by manipulating through them, by manipulating them into, because when And you can read the story like Faust, right? You can read the stories about it doesn't usually end well for the magician, right? Yeah. Anyway, so that's one form of magic. And he dismisses it. Again, notice doesn't say that there isn't a thing actually happening there, right? He's not saying people are just deluded. They're being deluded, but they're being deluded by the demons, whatever. But it's, anyway, he's not going to talk about it because he's certainly not going to talk about the mechanisms by which people try to do this, because the very existence of those things is itself a deception by the devil. However, there is this divine magic. This ability to make things happen through understanding of the natural world that God has made. That is the knowledge of man making manifest the knowledge of God. And it transforms nature into spectacles and all kinds of other things. So Nicholas the Glazier then asks, why don't those who possess this learning communicate it to all the people of God? This is a great benefit, right? And William's answer, because not all the people of God are ready to accept so many secrets, as it has often happened that the possessors of this learning have been mistaken for necromancers in league from birth with the devil, so that they have paid for their lives for their wish to share their knowledge with everyone. Notice what he's saying there. Sometimes one form of magic is mistaken for the other. Sometimes science is what we would call science is mistaken for sorcery, right? And this is, in a sense, an understandable mistake. I myself, he says, during trials in which someone was suspected of dealings with the devil, have had to take care not to use these lenses, resorting to eager secretaries who would read to me the writings I required. Otherwise, in a moment when the devil's presence was so widespread, and everyone could smell the odor of sulfur, I myself would have been considered a friend of the accused. We'll come back to the last sentence. 2 sentences. Think about this in the terms of, in the terms we've been looking at. Think of this in terms of signs and things, right? The thing in this case, the event, is something that is extraordinary, that makes something happen through a mechanism that everyone else seeing it doesn't understand, right? That's magic. The spectacles are magic to everybody, right? Even the Glazier, who believes he can replicate them, right, remarks how marvelous it is, right? He finds them magical, even though it's a magic that he believes that he could perform if he could study them, right? But so that's the thing. Sorry. But then it needs to be, that's the thing, but then it needs to be interpreted. What does it mean? What does it mean? What's going on? Is this the devil at work? Is this that dark kind of magic that shows that the person who is doing this magic is communicating with devils? Or is this the holy kind of magic, which is revealing the knowledge of God? Well, and notice what he says here. In certain contexts, there's always a risk in any context that people are going to mistake it for necromancy, right? People are going to mistake it for dark magic, for satanic power, even when it's not. There's always a chance. But when the contextual cues, right, are pointing in that direction anyway, when everyone can smell the odor of sulfur to begin with, it is very likely to be interpreted that way. Snark Baden says, bread seems like magic if you've never baked. Oh my goodness. bread seems completely magical to me. Yeah. So that question of interpretation, what does this mean? Right? This event. What is the significance of this event? What does it mean? What does it point to? There's this continuous reminder through this story that all events point, that all things point to other things, right? This pattern of interpretation is always not only necessary, but inescapable. And people go lots of different directions with it, as we've seen. But this process of doing interpretation, this process of understanding what things are just things, what things are signs to other things, what other things lie behind. This is what detection is. This is what deduction is, right? This is what Sherlock Holmes does too. This is not just a matter of biblical interpretation and scriptural theology, right? This is also about, the science of deduction at the same time. And then he adds, and finally, as the great Roger Bacon warned, the secrets of science must not always pass into the hands of all, for some could use them to evil ends. Often the learned man must make seem magic certain books that are not magic, in order to protect them from indiscreet eyes. Remember, what's the word science mean? We often forget this. In the Middle Ages, you get confronted with this all the time, because they use the word scientia, science. And I always found myself having to remind myself, no, that doesn't mean science in the modern sense. Knowledge, yeah, it means knowledge. Exactly. It just means knowledge. The knowledge of man and the knowledge of God. That's what science is, right? So here, now notice that he's here using the word magic in a different sense. Often the learned man must make seem magic certain books that are not magic, in order to protect them from indiscreet eyes. His concern, Roger Bacon's concern that he's expressing here, is that the secrets of science must not always pass into the hands of all. Not because they're going to be misunderstood, right? Not because you might get lynched by a crowd who thinks you're in league with the devil. He's already addressed that issue, legitimate concern. But in some cases, you want to be careful because they might not misunderstand, because they might understand all too well, because they might utilize them themselves and put them to evil ends. And so he talks about creating mystery. Make seem magic certain books that are not magic. You might have to try to make certain knowledge appear more inscrutable than it is, in order to protect them from indiscreet eyes. But watch what William gets himself into trouble here. And I think this is a legitimately interesting point. He's concerned about the secrets of science being used for evil ends. And they talk about gunpowder. He alludes to the invention of gunpowder, of which he's heard. And the Glazier is like, oh, well, that sounds like a great idea. And something that could be used, and William is like, it could be very useful, but it also could be used against other people, and great evil could be done with it. And the Glazier says, well, wouldn't it be great if the servants of God had it to be able to use it against the enemies of God? And then William says, yeah, and who counts as the enemy of God? Are you on the side of the Pope or of the Emperor, right? Which one is the servant of God, and against whom should it be used, right? So he points to the difficulties here, right? That it's dangerous, it's risky for the secrets of science always to get out. So Nicholas, the glazier, follows it up with, wherefore, it is best that in places like this, that is in the great library here in this monastery, not all books be within the reach of all. Yeah. Oh, William, so you agree with the policy of preventing anybody from going into the library, which we know William does not like, right? William says, this is another question, William said. Excess of loquacity can be a sin, and so can excess of reticence. I didn't mean that it is necessary to conceal the sources of knowledge. On the contrary, this seems to me a great evil. I meant that since these are arcana from which both good and evil can derive, the learned man has the right and the duty to use an obscure language, comprehensible only to his fellows. The life of learning is difficult, and it is difficult to distinguish good from evil, and often the learned men of our time are only dwarfs on the shoulders of dwarfs. I think that this paragraph is one of the least convincing moments that William has had yet. I think that William has argued himself into a corner here, honestly. He does not approve. He is frustrated by the life. He came to this monastery hoping and dreaming to be able to go into their library. That is, the legends of this library resound throughout the world. And he had really been looking forward to browsing in this library. And he's forbidden to go. And he doesn't like it. He does not approve. It seems to him a great evil to conceal the sources of knowledge. But then, what is he advocating? If knowledge can be used for good or for evil, and you have to be cautious about who learns about it, then what you're saying, William, is that you would set yourself as a gatekeeper to determine who gets to read some books and who gets to read others. In fact, exactly like the librarian here at the monastery, right? And what he argues for here, the learned man has the right and the duty to use an obscure language comprehensible only to his fellows. Comprehensible only to his fellows? So what? Other learned people are always going to put knowledge to good uses? You really believe that, William? Just because they have the learning to understand you? So if you speak an obscure language that only equally educated people or people educated in the same way can read, that proves their intentions are good? That doesn't even make any sense, William. The life of learning is difficult, and it is difficult to distinguish good from evil. Yeah, true. I mean, notice he emphasizes here at the end. It's not like he is naive about this. He knows that learned men of our time are sometimes only dwarfs on the shoulders of dwarfs. He's riffing on the dwarfs on the shoulders of giants. This is a famous phrase from the Middle Ages, which expressed how they believed those who came before to be much wiser and greater than they, but acknowledged that they, the medieval writers, often could see further than the ancients. Not because it's just a marvelous and typically medieval humility trope. Their knowledge is greater than the ancients, not because they themselves are greater than the ancients. The ancients are as giants and they are only dwarfs. But they can see further than the giants because they are the dwarfs who are standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before. But William says sometimes learned men of our time are in fact only dwarfs standing on the shoulders of dwarfs. Yeah. So, as I say, I think that William is, he's trying to make a distinction between revealing knowledge and concealing the sources of knowledge. But I think that this distinction, which, he seems to view as a really important one, really doesn't seem to me to hold. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding him in some way, the distinction that he is trying to make. But it sounds like he is making the argument exactly for the argument. I mean, he's not making it in the same way that the librarian made it. But it's actually a very, very similar argument. Yeah. So everyone except Calvin, when people are talking about indiscreet, unworthy eyes, aren't they usually talking about the uneducated common people? Often. And this is the distinction that William makes. Remember, the Glazier, Nicholas here, earlier in this conversation kind of assumed that, right? When William said, but you have to be careful who you reveal this to. And he's like, oh, are you worried about, how the simple might respond? He's thinking in that way, because that was a very common way of thinking. Like, we have to protect the simple from this. But William immediately says, like, oh, I'm not worried about the simple, right? The common people, the big concern there is that they'll be afraid, right? Like, I don't want to cause them fear and anxiety. Also with the implication, nor do I want them to try to burn me as a witch. But no, his concern is for wicked, learned people. Those are the people that he's primarily concerned about. Yeah, Jocelyn, it is a hard argument. Knowledge for all, or knowledge for those who can understand. And more importantly, knowledge only for those who will make good use of the knowledge and not wicked use of the knowledge. And who decides, right? It's tricky, right? And as I say, I think that this is a problem that William himself, yeah. Now, so Karina brings up okay. All right. Let me indulge in a short digression. A lot of people talk about this. I think that modern people misunderstand this fairly broadly. The idea that the Bible is to be protected from common people. Why it was exactly that the church was so opposed to the translation of the Bible into the vernacular. The point is not that the Bible was being kept secret. They were taught out of the Bible frequently. People knew the Bible. It's not that the Bible was being kept secret. Think about the stuff that we've been talking about in this book. What's important is not the signs. That is, what is critical. What makes all the difference is not the signs themselves. It's the interpretation of the signs, right? It's going from sign to thing and from that thing to another thing. What the church was keen to protect was not to protect people from the Bible or the Bible from people, but to hand over the Bible to people and say, it's up to you to interpret this however you'd like. That sounds like a lovely idea, but I bet you everybody here can think of negative examples of that kind of thing. Anyway, yeah. It's again, the thing that I think is so frequently misunderstood, it's connected with the fact that medieval people misunderstand what is called illiteracy in the Middle Ages. Yes, most people in the Middle Ages were literally illiterate in the sense that they did not know how to read. That doesn't mean that they were ignorant of books. Many people could not read, could not themselves read, because you didn't need to read. This was still an oral culture before the invention of the printing press. Now, there are elements, of course, of written culture. There are lots of written records being kept and stuff. But as far as in so many ways, throughout the Middle Ages, the world was still an oral culture, because even when they loved books, they primarily heard them. Think of the monks in this monastery. How much time did they spend reading, like reading with their eyes? Many of them are involved in studies and stuff, but think about their life. Think about the one day of cycles that we've seen so far, what we've seen of the monastic hours and things so far, right? How do they know the Benedictine rule? Because they have it on their bookshelf and take it down and study it? No, because it's read aloud to them, the whole group of them, every day, right? In the refectory. How do they know the Bible? Do they sit down with the Bible and have quiet time and read the Bible? No, it is read aloud to them, and they chant it and recite it as well, along with the people in this continuous round, right? How is it that they're able to quote these things all the time? Because they read them and study them all the time? No, because they hear them, right? And of course, I would add that in addition, a thing so frequently underestimated by modern people looking back at it, they also had lots and lots of pictures, right? This is why there are so many pictures carved on the walls and in the windows of the churches and cathedrals. There are many, many stories and entire narratives and propositions that are contained in the images and pictures. Anyway, and this is true in secular environments as well, right? You almost certainly can't afford a copy of the latest romance by Chrétien de Troyes, but you absolutely might be fortunate enough, if you are living, especially if you're near a court, to hear it read aloud. Most courtiers were illiterate. That doesn't make them ignorant. They were highly sophisticated, right? The culture was just different. So the fact that people look back at the Middle Ages through a modern lens, it is true, in the modern world, someone who is illiterate is at a massive disadvantage. Someone who is illiterate is in fact going to be ignorant of most things. Or at least that used to be more true. Nowadays, now that audiobooks are more available, it is now possible, I think, again, for someone who is illiterate still to mostly be able to, get learning. It's almost possible again. Not quite, but almost possible. But anyway, think of how we're, the difficulties created, even being able to read things like street signs and stuff like that, right? Our whole world is organized around text. And so, yes, in the modern world, if you're illiterate, you have a huge disadvantage. But in the Middle Ages, this was not the case. Reading and writing were specialized skills that only certain people needed. Not because you don't need or won't receive written stuff, but because there are other ways to receive it. And it was impractical anyway. Everything's handwritten, so the amount of writing floating around is very, very small, and we don't really need it. You don't really need it in the Middle Ages to be learned and capable and sophisticated. Anyway, so therefore, yes, it is true that the Bible didn't just want the church did not want the Bible just to be handed to people who have not been trained at all and say, here you go, take that home with you and read it, right? Figure it out, people, right? It's very true. They did not want that. They were very interested in having whether you want to read it generously and say they wanted to help people to understand, because it's actually pretty hard to understand a lot in it, or whether you look at it cynically and say they wanted to control its interpretation. Both are true, here and there all over the place, right? But there's that thing, and then there's the illiteracy thing, and so modern people kind of muddle this a lot when they look back at the medieval church and imagine nobody was even allowed to read, so that they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. That doesn't mean they didn't know it. Anyway, okay, there's my digression. And I would just add, to bring it back to the text, William does not, he has now on a couple of occasions resisted the kind of standard line of, it was very common to knock the ignorant, the common people, right? To say that the common people were just foolish or, and ignorant and can't be trusted. That was definitely a trope within, by learned medieval people. And William has resisted this in a couple different ways. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Okay. Look at Nicholas's account of what he read in the works of Albertus Magnus. Albertus Magnus, one of the... Albertus Magnus was a church father. He's not one of the old fathers like St. Augustine. He was from the previous century. Well, he's a 12th century dude. So a little bit, several generations ago from here. Albertus Magnus was particularly famous for, he was one of the people who advocated he was right around the time when basically Aristotle was rediscovered. We didn't know Aristotle in the Middle Ages. We didn't know most of Plato. But Aristotle, because we can't read Greek anymore in the Middle Ages. In Europe, obviously, in Western Europe. They didn't know Greek, and so they didn't have Aristotle. They didn't have most of Plato. They had a little bit of Plato, and they loved it. Right? The Timaeus was the primary one that they had. But then, in the time of Albertus Magnus, an Arab translated Aquinas and a bunch more Plato into Latin. And, oh man, it was like huge bestseller. Yes. Albertus Magnus was one of Thomas Aquinas' teachers. Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, so Albertus Magnus is famous for his learning, but he was a champion of, basically he knew that these were pagans, right? He knew Aristotle didn't know the Bible, right? He knew that Aristotle's wisdom was not the revealed wisdom of God, but he knew Aristotle was really wise, right? And so he was a huge advocate for the usefulness of drawing wisdom from outside Christian sources, right? Outside the traditions of the church. And you will have noticed already that the debates in the library and stuff, people are all citing Aristotle, right? And even somebody like Jorge, the old blind guy, doesn't respond to those by saying, yeah, well, what the heck did Aristotle know, right? He was a pagan. That's not, and keep in mind, by the way, the word pagan means generally means pre-Christian. Pre-Christian, non-Christian is like pre-Christian, non-Jew, basically, is what pagan means when it's used in this context. Anyway, he knew that Aristotle was a pagan, but he didn't care, right? Even Jorge doesn't say, oh, well, he's a pagan, doesn't count. He counts it. Right. Anyway, okay. So here's Nicholas talking about what he learned. Finally, when I was repairing the windows of the infirmary, I amused myself by leafing through some of Severinus's books. Do you remember Severinus is the herbalist who works in the infirmary? There was a book of secrets written, I believe, by Albertus Magnus. I was attracted by some curious illustrations, and I read some pages about how you can grease the wick of an oil lamp, and the fumes produced then provoke visions. You must have noticed, or rather you cannot have noticed yet, because you have not yet spent a night in the abbey, that during the hours of darkness the upper floors of the edificium is illuminated. At certain points there is a dim glow from the windows. Many have wondered what it is, and there has been talk of will-o'-the-wisps, or souls of dead librarians who return to visit their realm. Many here believe these tales. I think those are lamps prepared for visions. You know, if you take the wax from a dog's ear and grease a wick, anyone breathing the smoke of that lamp will believe he has a dog's head. Or if he is with someone else, the other will see a dog's head. And there is another unguent that makes those near the lamp feel big as elephants. And with the eyes of a bat and of 2 fish, whose names I cannot recall, and the venom of a wolf, you make a wick that, as it burns, will cause you to see the animals whose fat you have taken. And with a lizard's tail, you make everything around you seem of silver, and with the fat of a black snake and a scrap of shroud, the room will appear filled with serpents. I know this. Someone in the library is very clever. But couldn't it be the souls of the dead librarians who perform these feats of magic? Nicholas remained puzzled and uneasy. I hadn't thought of that. Perhaps. God protect us. It's late. Vespers have already begun. Farewell. And he headed for the church. Okay. Maureen says, don't try the dog's earwax thing at home. I was going to say, like scientific method, you could test it out, I suppose. Your dog won't enjoy it, presumably, but Stephen King says too late. I don't think we're going to reenact that one at Ranger Moot, JJ. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Anyway, notice how this is this is the scientific impulse, right? Think of this is magic, right? And notice that to the librarian, all of what he's describing is in the category of holy magic. How do you know? Why does he respond the way he does to William's question? Couldn't it be the souls of the dead librarians who performed these feats of magic? That makes him really uncomfortable, Nicholas, right? I hadn't thought of that. Perhaps God protect us. Right? Why does he respond like that? Why does he respond like that and then run away? Like he is completely done with this conversation at this point, right? After that one simple question. Yes, Calvin, that's exactly right. That would make it unholy magic. If the souls of dead librarians are performing feats of magic, that is necromancy. That's the shady side. Then we would have to suspect that in fact there is demonic activity involved. Yeah, he runs to go pray Vespers. Yeah, fervently. Right? But the rest of the things that he suggests, all these special things, these special kind of candles that you can make, right? This made me think of, some kind of like specialty candle shops where on the one hand you'll have like, all the different scented candles, and then on the other one, all of the visionary candles. Right. Yeah. Anyway, that's holy magic. And again, notice how it is still the scientific impulse. Now, all these things, whether these things, and I was just about to say something rash. I was just about to say all of these things don't work. But what do I know? I've never tried them, right? I mean, maybe there is an unguent, that if you burn it in a lamp makes you feel as big as an elephant, right? Quite possible, actually. There are many different things which, when you burn them and inhale the smoke, have psychotropic effects, right? Who knows? That's very possible. Whatever. Some of these things may work. Some of these things may not work. I leave you either to test them yourselves or not, and I don't recommend it, but, you know, you're grown-ups, presumably. But they all... What's the difference between those and the spectacles, right? Are these God's knowledge being revealed by the knowledge of men? Possibly. I mean, that would be true if, in fact, a dog's earwax does have that property. We can, you know, experiment with that and see if it does, in fact, have that property, right? But this is not... Again, this is the kind of thing which some people, many modern people, if they just picked up a passage of a medieval text for some reason, like they were being paid to do it or something, and I'm trying to figure out why they would pick up a scrap of medieval text, but say they did pick up a scrap of a medieval text and it said something like this: if you take the wax from a dog's ear and grease a wick, anyone breathing the smoke of that lamp will believe he has a dog's head. They would be like, wow, what a strange superstition, is likely, I think, what a modern person would say if they read something like that. But it's not superstition. It's science. It's science. It's naive science. It's probably imperfect science. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that probably all these things don't actually work. Right? But that doesn't make it not science. It just makes it immature science, right? Maybe whoever wrote this, whether it was Albertus Magnus or somebody else, maybe they rushed to publication a little too soon on this, right? Yeah. Jocelyn, we're absolutely before the age of scientific methodology. Absolutely we are. And that's, again, one of the reasons I'm making a joke about rushing to publication before proper experimentation, because there's no sense of proper experimentation, right? But again, the impulse, right, to say that this thing has this property, and if you do it to it, this other thing will happen. That's a scientific impulse, right? That is that we are learning the properties of matter and how we can manipulate those properties in order to bring about results that we find desirable. That's the scientific impulse. And the business about dog's earwax, if it's bad science, is only just because it hasn't been properly tested and might not work, right? But the impulse is still the scientific impulse. And again, you can see the shift in Nicholas's mind, right? All of this stuff, which might to a modern person seem magical or superstitious, is to Nicholas perfectly canny and holy and consistent with the writings of a great saint like Albertus Magnus. But the idea that there are souls of dead librarians performing feats of magic in the library at night freaks him out, because that's a completely different kind of magic. Yeah. So Jocelyn, it's not exact. So that's interesting. Jocelyn says, testing the veracity of a claim implies disbelief of the claim and desire for proof, harder to do with magical thinking. That's, yeah. So Jocelyn, I'm very far from suggesting that magical thinking didn't happen, right, at this time, or didn't inform any of this stuff. But magical thinking, using the phrase as we use the phrase magical thinking, right? And so I'm taking the phrase magical thinking to mean we want something to happen, and so, like, we want something to happen, we believe in something, and so therefore we believe that, you know, like, if we want it to happen, we believe it to be true, right? Like that you can make it true by wanting it, right? Jocelyn, you'll understand this. My wife talks about this a lot. My wife's a pediatrician and will often talk about the magical thinking of her patients, especially like pregnant teenage girls, for instance, who are capable of huge quantities of magical thinking. Just ignoring it and wishing it away and imagining that it has gone away because they have not thought about it, right? They've decided that it shouldn't be true. That kind of thing, right? That's magical thinking, right? But that kind of thinking is not what's going on here. That is not what informs the business about dog's earwax, right? It's not magical thinking which is in the direction of wish fulfillment, right? You could call it wish fulfillment in a sense that, like, you wish for the power to do something and look for something that gives you that power, right? But you're actually looking like that. Jocelyn, the distinction I would make between what we would call magical thinking and the magic that they are talking about here, either the magic that what they're calling magic that we would call science, holy magic in William's word, or the unholy magic that comes from Satan. Neither of those things is merely magical thinking in the modern sense. Both of them are frightfully practical. Again, I'm quasi-quoting C.S. Lewis there. Magicians are extremely practical. Both science and magic were both they were focused on finding and developing very practical processes by which you could repeatably, yes, create effects in the world around you. Either by repeatably manipulating demons, or by repeatably utilizing the qualities of physical bodies and things. Okay, Jocelyn says, it seems to me if you believe science comes from God, there is no reason to test it to prove it is real. No. What you're testing is to make sure that you've understood it properly, right? Again, it's revealing the knowledge of God through the knowledge of men. But this is true in science and in theology as well. That is, in both cases, they believed that there was truth, and therefore you could be wrong about it. That's what heresy is, right? There is an objective truth that exists out there, and you do have to find it. And if you're wrong about it, it's bad, and it's not going to work. So yeah, it's not quite, science isn't coming from God, right? As JJ says, not in the sense of like through revelation. It's not an act of disbelief to question. Again, if someone were to say, you know what, I tried the dog's earwax thing, Totally didn't work, right? It smelled pretty bad, going out on a limb there. It smelled pretty bad, but it absolutely did not make me believe I had a dog's head. And in fact, someone else was standing right there, and she did not see a dog's head on me. Totally didn't happen. Would that create a crisis of faith? Would the person who experimentally tried it and found that it didn't work, would they, believe that they were calling God into question in some way? No, it's not. They would just say, this piece of human knowledge had in fact fallen short of the truth. It wasn't true. It should be rejected. You are supposed to test and make sure that the things that you believe are true. That's true in theology as well. Yeah, Mrs. Manrick, that's a good way to think about it. The church taught that everything was consistent that the whole world is consistent because God was in control of every entity in heaven and earth and in the seas below, so consistency was expected. Seeming fickleness was a challenge to prove. It was a challenge to prove otherwise. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So again, it is true, Jocelyn, that the true, a fuller expression of the scientific method, a fuller expression of and consistent application of the scientific method had not yet caught on. But it doesn't come out of nowhere when it does catch on, right? The impulse was there. And JJ, thank you. JJ, you have this remarkable talent for either finding a passage that I'm alluding to, or sometimes even plucking the passage out of my head and looking it up in your ebook and quoting it. That's exactly the Bible line that I was thinking of from 1 Thessalonians. Examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good. Yes, that principle is a principle of theology as well. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I knew that the magic thing was going to be a little bit digressive here this evening. Judy, in a sense, yes. Judy says, are we to see William as being not quite there yet, there being using the scientific method properly? Yes, Judy, I think that Echo he's depicting a person who, if he were living in 19th century London, would probably be setting up a consulting detective agency. If he were, living in the 18th century, would probably be a scientist, right? But instead, he was born in the 14th century. And what would that look like? Again, that's sort of the what if at the heart of this, right? What if somebody with the mental abilities and proclivities of Sherlock Holmes were born in the 14th century? What would he do? What would it look like, right? That's the kind of essential conceit, I think, of this entire story, right? And the answer, become a Franciscan, be an inquisitor, probably have a problem with that, right? These are really interesting ways of kind of working that out. But yes, because he is, and Echo is trying to make him a creature of his time. And this is the thing that is so often so imperfectly done in modern works that try to depict the Middle Ages, right? Or any ancient anything. Just when you're trying to depict an ancient culture, but you have, people acting with the, working through the thought processes of the modern world and such. I think that Echo is being careful. I'm not saying he's doing it perfectly, but I think he's being careful to try not to do that. Anyway. And yes, Eric, you can totally see Echo is plainly one of the sort of sidelights of this book is sort of a claim or an attempt by Umberto Eco to draw attention to the idea that Roger Bacon in particular is like the father of the scientific method and doesn't get enough credit for that. Right. That's kind of one of the things, one of the sort of arguments that kind of underlies a lot of what's going on here. I think. Anyway, okay. Let's keep going. This is from William and Adso's discussion about the probable cause of death for Adelmo. And so think whether it is not less, how shall I say it, less costly for our minds to believe that Adelmo, for reasons yet to be ascertained, threw himself of his own will from the parapet of the wall, struck the rocks, and, dead or wounded as he may have been, sank into the straw. Then the landslide caused by the storm that night carried the straw and part of the terrain and the poor young man's body down below the east tower. Why do you say this solution is less costly for our minds? Dear Adso, one should not multiply explanations and causes unless it is strictly necessary. If Adelmo fell from the east tower, he must have got into the library. Someone must have first struck him, so that he would offer no resistance, and then this person must have found a way of climbing up to the window with a lifeless body on his back, opening it and pitching the hapless monk down. But with my hypothesis, we need only Adelmo, his decision, and a shift of some land. Everything is explained using a smaller number of causes. You see, of course, the technique that he is using, right? He is using Occam's razor. And where did he learn this principle of Occam's razor? From Occam, who is one of his teachers, right? Occam has been referred to. Occam and Roger Bacon are the two who are primarily William's teachers and influences. William of Occam, I should call him, but I didn't want to call him William because that's confusing. Steve, exactly, you suggest the other William. Occam's razor is often misunderstood. That is, sometimes people will suggest that they're applying Occam's razor when they say, like, the simpler of two solutions is more likely to be true. That's not exactly right? Yes, a plurality is not to be posited without necessity, right? Yeah, exactly. So one really obvious and simple modern application would be Occam's razor is a reasonably good argument against most conspiracy theories. For instance, Eric, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, right? Yes, it's possible to explain something by imagining this enormous and almost impossibly efficient conspiracy. But one has to admit that it's a little bit less likely than, other suggestions that don't involve so many additional additional causes. I just wanted to draw attention to Occam's razor in case you missed it here. Again, which he learned from the source. This is during dinner. During dinner, Adso is thinking about the food like a teenager. And but then the reading is going on. The reading of the Benedictine rule is going on. I was reminded of it by a vigorous grunt of assent from Jorge, and I realized we had reached the point at which a chapter of the rule is always read. I understood why Jorge was so content, since I had listened to him that afternoon. The reader was saying, "Let us imitate the example of the prophet who says, 'I have decided, I shall watch over my way so as not to sin with my tongue. I have put a curb upon my mouth. I have fallen dumb, humbling myself. I have refrained from speaking even of honest things.' And if in this passage the prophet teaches us that sometimes our love of silence should cause us to refrain from speaking even of licit things, How much more should we refrain from illicit talk to avoid the chastisement of this sin? And then he continued, but vulgarities, nonsense, and jests we condemn to perpetual imprisonment in every place, and we do not allow the disciple to open his mouth for speech of this sort. This is the passage from the rule that Jorge was alluding to when everybody was laughing at Adelmo's fantastical illuminations, right? They should refrain from illicit talk. Notice one thing here. There are licit things and illicit things. There is licit talk and illicit talk. But sometimes it is not good to talk even of licit things. So licit, I forget which prophet. This is it's a quotation from one of the Old Testament prophets. It's David. Okay, yeah, it's a psalm. Yeah. David would have been counted among the prophets in this context. Psalm 39. Thanks. Thanks, Eric. Okay. So licit, of course, means legal, right? So there are bad things and there are good things. And you can speak of good things and you can speak of bad things. And it can be a good thing to speak of bad things, but sometimes it can even be a good thing to not speak of good things. Anyway, you see how this all, again, connects to the themes that we're talking about. These are sort of some of the things in question. It's not just enough to speak of good things or to say right things. Remember, for instance, the effect that Ubertino's condemnation of lustfulness. Remember the effect that it had on poor Adso, right? Where his own heart was not stirred to devotion. He was getting a little heated, imagining the sins which Ubertino was describing, right? That would be an example. His words were licit, right? And what he was saying was holy in the sense that he was condemning vice, right? And yet the signs themselves, the words themselves, had a quite different effect on Adso, who was hearing them, right? The idea which we had introduced to us there in the Ubertino scene, and which the rule of Saint Benedict is emphasizing here, this is one of the reasons why it's big on silence, the Benedictine rule, because you have to be careful. Yes, JJ, that is absolutely correct. It's like what I was saying about confession before, and how often the prompt to confess sin would lead the person or the priest himself into sinful thoughts, right? I mean, it can be dangerous, right? Tell me again about your impure sexual fantasies. There can be problems there. And as you say, even in a different context, it reminds me, he says, of how prayer requests can sometimes drift dangerously close to gossip circles. Yeah. Same kind of dangers, right? So one of these other things that we see. So think about this, like this slipperiness of speech. Like it's not simple. There's no simple solution here. You can't just say, only talk about good things. Or if you must refer to something that's harmful or bad, at least do so in a way that, clearly condemns it. Well, that's what Ubertino was doing, right? it's slippery, right? Signs and things are complicated. It's really hard. And then think also about what we were just discussing before about interpretations, right? About somebody who reveals holy magic, right? Who's like, hey, hey, person who can't see very well, try out these spectacles. And then that person who offered the spectacles gets burned as a witch, right? It's difficult, right? It's complicated. It's really, really challenging, and also totally, totally inescapable, right? That the complexity of that situation is totally inescapable. Well, Saint Benedict has a suggestion for how to escape it: silence, right? That'll help. I'm delighted to announce this is the final passage of day 1, because we totally did it like I confidently said we would. Keep your eye on that spot, William said to me. There could be a passage leading to the edificium. Under the cemetery? And why not? In fact, now that I think about it, there must be an ossarium somewhere, if they can't possibly have buried all their monks for centuries in that patch of ground. But do you really want to enter the library at night? I asked, terrified. Where there are dead monks and serpents and mysterious lights, my good Adso? No, my boy. I was thinking about it today, and not from curiosity, but because I was pondering the question of how Adelmo died. Now, as I told you, I tend toward a more logical explanation, and all things considered, I would prefer to respect the customs of this place. Then why do you want to know? Because learning does not consist only of knowing what we must or we can do, but also of knowing what we could do and perhaps should not do. So tricky, right? Think how close this is to William's convictions about who should know, like, you can only trust people with a knowledge of gunpowder who aren't going to put it to wicked uses, right? Learning does not consist only of knowing what we must or we can do. That's one thing, certainly, that learning consists of, right? We have to know what we must do. We should know what we can do. But learning, he says, also consists of knowing what we could do, even if we shouldn't do it, right? And this, again, as I say, this relates back to William's own conflicted relationship with the restriction of knowledge in the library. And notice how it comes right after his statement that, all things considered, I would prefer to respect the customs of this place. He's not planning to enter the library at night, not because he is terrified of dead monks and serpents and mysterious lights. And presumably not because he thinks he's going to believe himself to have a dog's head. But he would prefer to respect the customs of this place, which he didn't want to respect, right? He didn't like the restriction that was being placed upon his learning by not being given free access to all of the books. Yeah. This question. What is it okay to learn? What is it okay to know? Who should control knowledge? And why? What are good reasons to control knowledge? That is, to limit the knowledge of others. And what are bad reasons? And how do you know? These are really important questions, right, that this story is very concerned of. Yeah. Yeah, Steve says that William has the human problem of not being able to conform to the second part, perhaps should not do. Yeah, the perhaps should not do part of it. Yes, exactly. Yep. Hey, let's start the second day because we can. Yeah, this'll do. It's matins. Matins is the early morning thing that happens in the middle of the night. What is it, like 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 in the morning, something like that? The monks were in the stalls, 60 figures made indistinguishable by their habits and cowls, 60 shadows barely illuminated by the fire from the great tripod, 60 voices joined in praise of the Almighty. And hearing this moving harmony, vestibule of the delights of paradise, I asked myself whether the abbey were truly a place of concealed mysteries, of illicit attempts to reveal them, and of grim threats. Because it now seemed to me, on the contrary, the cenacle of virtue, vessel of learning, ark of prudence, tower of wisdom, domain of meekness, bastion of strength, thurible of sanctity. Come on now. Thurible of sanctity. Yeah. I've been contemplating adding that to my Twitter bio, but I'm not sure. A thurible, of course, is the thing you swing around with. The THUR means it has to do with incense, right? So if you've ever seen like the big old incense ball, right, that you swing around with the incense in, right, to incense the room, different sense. That's a thurible. The ball that's swinging around is the thurible. Notice all of these things. They're vessels, right? Cenacle. Golly, I'm blanking. What is a cenacle? There's a specific meaning to that, but I don't even remember. Vessel of learning, ark of prudence, tower of wisdom, domain of meekness, bastion of strength, thurible of sanctity. It's a little heavy for Signum's motto. Yeah. Anyway, the monastery seems like this to Adso. Remember the business about like things and signs and interpretations, right? What is the monastery? A place of concealed mysteries, of illicit attempts to reveal them, of grim threats? He's not denying those things. The point that Adso is making here is not that in this moment he is convincing himself that those things don't exist. Right? He's not saying, I haven't perceived any grim threats. There are no concealed mysteries here. He's not convincing himself that those things are not true. What he's doing here, when he says, I asked myself whether the abbey were truly a place of concealed mysteries, what he's saying is, are those things the truth about this place? To use a to use an Aristotelian way of understanding this. I'll use the Latin terms. Aristotle taught us that everything has a substance and it has accidents. The accidents of something are just the things that you encounter. They're superficial. The substance of a thing is what it really is. What it is in its essence. The word essence, by the way, is the word that Shakespeare would have used. So in Shakespeare's English, essence means substance in this Aristotelian sense. In Shakespeare's English, essence means substance, and the word that he uses for accident is shadow. You've got a thing has an essence, but then it also has shadows, which just means the parts of the superficial things that you interact with. Yes, Eric, if you've got a person, the substance of that person is they're a human, right? They're a human being made in the image of God. That's the substance of the person, a medieval would say. The accidents of that person would be things, yes, like height, hair color, odor, right? Anything you can interact with your senses are the accidents of a thing. So one accident is a single example of that, right? So if you have a piece of food, its taste is one of its accidents. One accident is taste. Another accident is color, right? Another accident might be temperature, right? Or whatever, right? None of those things are essential to it. They're not substantial. This, of course, if I can just go one small step further to make this explicit, because you will have been, if you're not familiar with this, you may still have been recognizing these words. The word transubstantiation is an Aristotelian word. The description of what happens to the host, to the wafer, during the Mass, when it is made into the body of Christ. It is transubstantiated. Its substance changes. Its substance was bread before. Its substance becomes the body of Christ. Its accidents do not change. The wafer looks, smells, tastes, feels exactly the same both before and after transubstantiation has occurred. But the substance, the essence, what the thing essentially is, has changed. That's the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation of the host, by the way. Same with the blood and the wine. Still tastes like wine, but it's now the blood of Christ. Its essence, its substance is the blood of Christ. He's not using that language right here. Adzo, I mean. But I believe that this is what he is getting at when he says, I asked myself whether the Abbey were truly a place of concealed mysteries. He's not saying, are the mysteries, illicit attempts, and grim threats real? Or are they fake? Or are they just an illusion or whatever? No, he's saying, are they the truth about the Abbey? Is that the essence of what this place is? And in this moment, here in Matins, he decides, no. These other things, cenacle of virtue, vessel of learning, ark of prudence, thurible of sanctity. This is what the Abbey really is. That's the substance of the Abbey. Any mysteries, threats, and illicit attempts are accidents, right? That's not the deeper reality here. And this is both very significant and also ironic, because, of course, the second corpse is about to be discovered, right? In fact, this very moment of worship is going to be interrupted by the discovery of the body. And yes, all those images he's using are images of containment. They are. Thanks for pointing that out. What is the substance? What is the essence of the monastery? It's not virtue, learning, prudence, wisdom, meekness, and sanctity, right? Those things, God is those things, right? Those things all are from God. They're not essentially connected. What is the monastery? It is the vessel that contains those things, right? It is the thurible which holds sanctity, the sanctity which emerges like incense right? The thurible is just a ball of metal, right? It doesn't have the good smell, right? That, that scents the room when you wave the thurible around, right? It doesn't make the sanctity. It isn't the sanctity. It's the ball that holds the sanctity, right? That's what the monastery is. It's not the learning. Learning is from God, but it's a vessel that holds the learning, right? The monastery is the container. That's its essence, right? That's its essence. What it is, what is it truly a place of? It is truly the container of all of these things. That's its purpose. That is the essence of what the monastery is and should be, right? And in this moment, he kind of comes in touch with this. This is like Adso sort of touching base, right? Being kind of grounded in this way. Again, it doesn't change the reality of the other things. Just like, so for instance, a piece of food might go bad, right? Stench and like horrible taste and even making you ill could become accidents of this piece of food, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that its substance has changed. A piece of bread, fresh, warm, delicious bread, older, getting stale bread, moldy bread, still bread, right? The essence is still the same, though its accidents may be importantly changed, right? And again, I think it's in this moment here in Matins, on day 2, we can be sensible of the irony here, right? No sooner does he have this insight than the body is discovered, right? And it's easy to be like, well, that didn't last long, right? Thurible of sanctity, domain of meekness. We got somebody killing folks and dunking them in pig's blood, right? That's doesn't seem terribly meek or prudent or virtuous or holy, right? And yet, I don't think the purpose of this passage is merely irony. That is a function of this passage, but I don't think it's just that. Anyway, yeah, it's a statement of the monastery's purpose and ideal. Yes, and Eric, a glimpse of the fact that he, in this moment, when the monastery is performing one of its functions, matin prayers and singing, that Adso feels that it is performing its purpose and ideal, right? This, of course, raises the question, like, what is the monastery? What is the abbey, truly? Right? What is the purpose of the monastery? Think of this in connection with the library and the mission statement that the librarian read out before, right? That's another kind of version of this, or, potential version of this, right? Anyway, all right. It's getting late. I'll only continue my reckless dash forward into day 2 for so long. Let's see. Why don't we go definitely through Prime? Tell you what, let's go ahead and read Terce also, because I can't be stopped. So let's read through Terce of day 2. Okay, so that's essentially 3 chapters. All right, off we go. All right, thanks everybody. I will see you guys next week. Bye now.